There are plenty of reasons to love The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Whether it's the timeless art style, the fantastic music, or just the general cheeriness that emanates from every corner of the screen, it's easy to see why many longtime Zelda fans, myself included, cite Wind Waker as their favorite game in the series. But there is one really important aspect of what makes Wind Waker so special that I think gets overshadowed from time to time, and that's this little guy right here. Of course, this is our not-so-titular hero, Link, the character you play as in every Zelda game, at least every officially canonized Zelda game, that is. Link has had quite a few different designs over the years, but there's always been a couple key visual trademarks that have persisted throughout. While his age may vary, he's always been a young, elfish-looking male with blondish hair, often dressed in green and primarily wields a sword and shield, and I guess sometimes a crossbow. Honestly, I'm not quite sure where Link's crossbow training falls on the spectrum of official Zelda releases. At a glance, the Link from Wind Waker, and technically Spirit Tracks and Phantom Hourglass for that matter, seems to check all these boxes, so what makes him so special? Well, the key is, despite all these similarities, this version of Link is by far the most expressive he's ever been, and I want to spend the next couple of minutes detailing how this works and why it matters. Most of the credit for Link's expressiveness in this game goes to his facial animations, and, well, it does feel a bit generous to call them animations as they're mostly just single frame transitions, but that doesn't make them any less impactful. All the various faces Link makes through the course of the game mostly amount to different combinations of how his eyes and mouth are depicted. It reminds me a lot of how stop-motion filmmakers like Studio Laika will 3D print hundreds of upper and lower halves of their puppets' faces to create literally thousands of different expressions for their animators to make use of. For Zelda, this is a really modest approach, but it fits wonderfully with Nintendo's somewhat minimalist design aesthetic as well as the hardware limitations of the time. Creating high-quality, believably human facial animations back in 2002 was really hard, but the somewhat fascinating thing about this approach is that it's actually so simple that it probably could have been implemented back on the N64. So it's not just the intuitive design choice that makes Link feel so lively, but also Nintendo's willingness to depict him with a far wider range of emotions this time around. In the only other 3D games before this, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Link's facial expressions were much more limited. It's admittedly a little better when Link is a child, but after you obtain the Master Sword in Ocarina of Time, and Link ages by 7 years, he spends most of the game looking stoically serious, especially during some very pivotal scenes. In contrast, look at all the ways I can describe Wind Waker's Link based solely on his facial expressions. Indifference, apprehension, sadness, uncertainty, happiness, disbelief, shock, and even fear. And this is just the stuff I pulled from the first hour of the game. All these descriptors vary from subtle to bold, which give Link the appearance of having a more nuanced internal life. Furthermore, it's not just the facial expressions that are putting in some work here. His body language also does a great deal to make Link's expressions feel more dynamic. Just look at the way he jumps for joy here after beating a boss, or how he exaggeratedly slumps over, gasping for breath when he's at low health. All these little details imbue Link with a level of personality that the series had never seen before or since. And contradictory to the philosophy of previous games, it makes him more relatable. I don't think it's any mystery that the reason why Link previously had such a limited emotional spectrum was to make him more of a blank slate character that players could project their own feelings onto. This is also of course why Link is the only character in the series who never talks, even after the game switched to using voice acting in a limited capacity. It's a design philosophy that has a long history, and Nintendo is far from the only developer to use it to varying degrees of success. Take a first-person shooter like Half-Life 2. The player character, Gordon Freeman, never speaks, but the other characters in the game will often directly address him, and they'll have quasi-conversations together, even without Gordon ever responding. The idea here is the same as not having Link talk in The Legend of Zelda. By not giving Gordon dialogue, he can't say something that the player would find inconsistent with their perception of his character. But I think this ends up creating interactions that are more awkward than immersive. It feels more like I'm watching an episode of Dora the Explorer than experiencing an interactive story that I'm a part of. Wind Waker is one of the few examples of Nintendo bypassing the stumbling block altogether. Because of how they make use of Link's many expressions, they basically get to have their cake and eat it too. You still get to keep your rule about Link not talking, but through facial expressions and body language, he's able to have at least somewhat of a back and forth with the other characters, instead of just staring blankly at them. He gets to feel like he actually exists in the world of the game. Granted, there are still occasions where he looks blankly lost in thought while some pretty important stuff is going down, but for the first time in the series, I would say these moments are the exceptions instead of the norm. There's even an added layer to this that better fits his character, because giving Link more emotional depth is also going to naturally make him feel a little more vulnerable. In this particular version of the standard Zelda story, Link's destiny as a legendary hero is downplayed quite a lot. There's still a fair amount of talk about the previous hero of time who defeated Ganon ages ago, but the Link we play as is mostly just filling a role. He's not necessarily chosen by a higher power. In fact, the very last thing you do in the game before setting off for a final showdown with Ganondorf is to actually recompile the scattered pieces of the Triforce of Courage, the heroic symbol of justice that Link was usually just born with in the other games. This makes him feel a bit more like an everyman, like he could have been one of us. Which is kind of what the whole blank slate strategy was about in the first place, right? The Wind Waker is still not a perfect game. In fact, it has some of the most obvious flaws from a technical perspective of just about any other Zelda game. The quest to obtain all the Triforce shards is undoubtedly a laborious chore, even in the trimmed down HD version. The dungeons are probably some of the easiest ones in the entire series, and they very clearly had to cut an entire dungeon out of the game late in the project's development. And of course, the game does no favors for Princess Zelda either. I still really hate how it suddenly changes her from the competent pirate captain Tetra into the more submissive Princess Zelda halfway through the game, and literally locks her in an underground room until she's of course kidnapped by Ganondorf, just so she can eventually be saved by Link. But these games have never really treated Zelda very well, so it's hard to dock it points, at least when we're strictly comparing it to the other games in the series. But I'm ultimately able to look past these issues because none of them are the things I remember about the game. The moments I always think back so fondly on are Link getting increasingly anxious about getting catapulted into a fortress via this barrel, or the genuine sadness he feels when he's leaving home for the first time. And of course the pure joy he shows when he finally is able to rescue his sister. And these moments bolster the more traditional scenes that require Link's stern courage as well. I honestly don't believe this epic showdown at the end would have anywhere near the same impact if you didn't have all the smaller, happier moments along the way to contrast it. Wind Waker is my favorite Zelda game because it has a main character I actually care about. Creating a protagonist the player will empathize with is mostly about creating a meaningful relationship between them and the player. So even though this incarnation of Link is by far the most defined, he's also the one I see the most of myself in. Because in reality, people don't relate to blank slates. People relate to people. And this version of Link is the closest he's ever come to feeling like a real person.